Good evening, everyone, and welcome to our inaugural American Politics and Government Summit. It's been so encouraging to be with you all for the past 24 hours and to hear your ideas and your enthusiasm for expanding the field of knowledge in politics and government. And just the conversations that I've been having, I've been reminded of one of my favorite quotations from C.S. Lewis on the reading of old books. C.S. Lewis writes, "Those of us who have been true readers all of our life seldom realize the enormous extension of our being which we owe to authors. We realize it best when we talk with an unliterary friend. He may be full of goodness and good sense, but he inhabits a tiny world in which we would be suffocated. The man who is contented to be only himself and therefore less a self is in a prison. My own eyes are not enough for me. I will see through those of others." And it's so encouraging to be in a room where we're with 100 other people who have all read the same old books, who have all dedicated their lives to seeing through the eyes of others, and the friendship and the camaraderie that instills, especially compared to perhaps other faculty association conferences. I know that means a lot to me, and so it's a delight to be here with you all as friends and as scholars. So before I introduce our keynote speaker, there are three things that I would like to share with you. First and foremost, in some of this, in the first point Dan touched on this morning, why are we here? Secondly, what will we accomplish? And third, how will ISI support you in your role as scholars and as faculty members? Well, first and foremost, we're here because we wanted to provide a space, an association, a conference where you all as scholars could advance research and ideas and knowledge and grow in professional development in the fields of politics and government, broadly understood, without the narrow constraints and ideological confines of your typical professional association. And also so that you could grow in friendship and also plot various ways that we can help to take back our universities, take back our states, and take back our country, one at a time. So that's, from your vantage point, that's why we decided to host this event. Secondly, from ISI's position, ISI's mission is to educate college students in the tradition of ordered liberty that goes all the way back to Jerusalem, Rome, Athens, London, all the way to Philadelphia, and to really introduce students to that great conversation. And pursuing this mission like we do with chapters on 175 campuses and over 80 newspapers would only be possible with our professors. Our professors are truly the lifeblood of ISI. So we've made a serious commitment to do more to engage our professors professionally and intellectually. And this is the start of what will be an annual tradition and additional programming that we'll do throughout the country and at ISI's headquarters to draw you closer to our institution so that we can help better accomplish our mission. So what do we hope to accomplish here this weekend? Well, the big picture goal is to restore excellence to the fields of political science and government, and to restore excellence to higher education as a whole. Now, that is a monumental task, and it's one that's made even more challenging by the fact that when we look at the state of higher education today, by nearly every qualitative and quantitative metric, it is failing both our scholars and our students. However, we are not alone in that observation. In fact, many great humanists and defenders of the great books tradition have been lamenting this fact in their own generation for well over 100 years. I think of someone like Paul Elmer Moore, who was writing in 1915 about the state of things at Harvard and complaining that there has been a noticeable slackening of standards. He said some people outside the university are saying that people go to college these days and they don't learn anything. They come out learning less than they did when they went in. So he was saying this in 1915, and he said, that's probably an exaggeration. That might be slander, but there is some truth to it. There's sort of this growing sense, and you could see it on the pages of the Harvard campus newspaper. Evidently, Harvard's president gave an address, and it was really a sense that urgent reform needed to happen, or else higher education, Harvard even, would become a wasteland 100 years ago. We see Dorothy Sayers about 30 years later giving a talk at Oxford University lamenting the same thing, saying, we've been running on borrowed capital for the past, she says, 400 to 500 years. Which is, laughable to us today, thinking, the state of Oxford in 1947. But here's the quote from her. She said, quote, "We must turn back the wheel of progress some 400 or 500 years to the point at which education began to lose sight of its true object, towards the end of the Middle Ages. For Sayers, we have been living on borrowed capital, and we will face a civilizational reckoning." So perhaps we are in that reckoning today, but you can find similar quotes from T.S. Eliot, Christopher Dawson, Albert J. Nock, Irving Babbitt, and of course ISI was founded 70 years ago in 1953 to fight for liberty in higher education. But the fact that we are in good company in terms of diagnosing this problem doesn't mean that our own situation is any less acute, or that the challenge before us won't require a great amount of courage if we are to confront it. And going back to Paul Elmer More, I really do think that we are in a civilizational battle. Paul Elmer More puts it like this. He says, "We are prone to forget that civilization has always been a tour de force, so to speak, a little hard-won area of order and self-subordination amidst a vast wilderness of anarchy and barbarism that are continually threatening to overrun their bounds." So in some sense, the task of fighting for civilization against anarchy and barbarism, it's something that each generation needs to take up, but it's also something that each individual needs to take up, not only every semester, but every day of their life, because there are forces external to ourselves, but also there are forces from within our own nature that we are having to fight to tame and to civilize, and that is what the purpose of Lent is all about. I'm not here to give a homily, but this is what we struggle with as human beings. So in order to turn this around, in order to restore excellence to politics and government and to higher education on a whole, it will require each of us working in our own individual and community capacities to do it. It'll take our professors working in the classroom, working on campus centers, doing one-on-one mentorship with students. It will take conferences and associations like this one. It will take institutions like the Claremont Institute and the Heritage Foundation, who have generously sponsored this event, and many more groups. It'll take universities, places like Hillsdale, my alma mater, Grove City, Thomas Aquinas. Hopefully New College will be added to that list sometime soon if Charles is successful on the board, as well as political leadership, which we heard about today at lunch, all the things that they're doing in the state of Florida to restore excellence and perhaps even the great books to higher education in the public sphere. So I'm excited to partner with you all on this valiant effort, and that challenge begins this weekend. Finally, how will ISI help you as faculty members? Well, we do a number of things for our faculty members, and Claire is doing a wonderful job leading our efforts with our faculty engagement. So we will continue to have national conferences like this one. We host Liberty Funds throughout the academic year that we would love for you to participate in. And we are currently building a 7,000 square foot conference center at ISI's headquarters in Wilmington, Delaware, where we hope to do 10 week-long summer schools a year, as well as about a dozen weekend retreats. And we would love it to be a place where you can actually bring your students for weekend retreats and where we can provide funding for enrichment and for programs. Second, we would like to support you in providing funding to bring guest speakers to your college campuses or to host programs at your college campuses for students. Third, ISI Books. So some of you may have heard we sold our book division to Regnery Publishing about a month ago, but we are continuing with a special imprint of ISI Books at Regnery, where we will plan to publish about 2 to 3 books a year. So Dan McCarthy is heading up that project. So if you have book ideas, see Dan, but also more importantly, if any of the classic ISI books, the hundreds of titles that we've published over the last 30 years, or really any other book that is really great books related or connected to the conservative intellectual movement, if you would like to lead discussion groups on your campus or you want those available to your students, we will purchase those and send those to you. So please let us know. And then 2 more things, Modern Age Journal. You all, as members of our association, will have subscription to Modern Age. we are launching a new website for Modern Age that will have daily content that will happen sometime around the fall, and we would love for you all to consider writing and publishing with Modern Age. And then finally, ISI is doing about 150 events a year when you count all of the lectures, debates, and seminars that we're doing, and we would like you all to help teach at those programs and to get involved in ISI more directly. So I want you to know that we are here to serve you. Our faculty truly are, as I said, sort of the heartbeat of ISI programming. And so we are open to creative ideas that you might generate. We can't fund or support all of them, but please don't let that deter you. We are here to support you in your mission and our mission to educate students for liberty. So thank you. I would now like to introduce tonight's keynote speaker, Dr. Charles Kesler. Many of you have known Charles since before I was born, and have been friends with him for many, many years. So I will keep my remarks relatively brief, but I do owe a great debt of gratitude to Charles. I was a fellow with the Lincoln Fellowship at the Claremont Institute several years ago, and it was a very formative intellectual experience for me. And I'm very grateful to Claremont. I'm also grateful to the many professors that I had at Hillsdale College who were either are longtime friends of Charles or even students of him over the years. So in many respects, he's had both a direct and indirect impact on my own formation, as well as the impact that Claremont Review of Books has had, especially over the last 4 or 5 years, publishing interesting, substantive, sometimes provocative articles that have really helped to enrich the conversation. And in many respects, the CRB is the leading, the co-leading intellectual quarterly along with Modern Age. Right. We'll give you that honor tonight. So Charles Kesler is a senior fellow of the Claremont Institute, editor of the Claremont Review of Books, host of Claremont's The American Mind video series, and the Dengler Dykema Distinguished Professor of Government at Claremont McKenna College. He also teaches at the Claremont Institute's Publius Fellows Program and Lincoln Fellows Program. He received his BA in Social Studies and his MA and PhD in Government from Harvard University. From 1989 to 2008, Dr. Kesler was director of CMC's Henry Salvatori Center for the Study of Individual Freedom in the Modern World. He was the 2018 recipient of the Bradley Prize. And in September 2000 to March 2001, he served as vice chairman of the advisory committee to the U.S. Congress's James Madison Commemoration Commission. He was selected in June 2000 as a member of the Scholars Commission on the Jefferson Hemings issue sponsored by the Thomas Jefferson Heritage Society. He is also a trustee at New College, and he is the author of his most recent book, I Am the Change, Barack Obama and the Crisis of Liberalism, and he has a new book that he is working on the Federalist Papers. And his address tonight will be on the New Right and the American political tradition, which will foreshadow a conversation he will have with Yoram Hazony tomorrow afternoon during lunch. So without further ado, please join me in welcoming Dr. Charles Kesler.
Thank you very much, Johnny, for those beautiful words. True, I don't know. Beautiful, certainly, but thank you. It's a great pleasure to be here. I'd be grateful to Johnny Burtka and Ryan Williams and Bridget Wagner, who was present at my wedding almost 20 years ago. In fact, next month. She was not the bride. I would be grateful to them for holding this conference anywhere, but for assembling us in Florida in February, in the midst of a huge winter storm tearing across the Midwest. You deserve special honor, all three of you. I mean, your political prudence is well known. But who knew it extended this far, to meteorological even cosmological things. I'm happy for another reason, that I'm able to express my gratitude to their organizations. ISI, one of the earliest flowers of movement conservatism, as it used to be called, planted by William F. Buckley Jr. himself, who served as its first president, to the Heritage Foundation, where I have held summer fellowships and taught and over the years, and always found it a sparkling think tank, whatever that means exactly. It's more it's both tanky and thinky, and I think that's as it should be. And of course, the Claremont Institute, which, though founded in 1978 or so, likes to think of itself as one of the first flowers of the new right, about which I'm going to be talking a little bit. Among the three of them, these institutions express really the whole history of the modern American conservative movement, and I hope sincerely its future as well. So it's meet and proper that we convene in Florida for another reason, not the climate, but what Montesquieu called the climate of opinion. In the 2022 midterm elections, the vaunted red wave fizzled almost everywhere, except here, where it hit good and hard, sweeping in, among others, of course, Governor DeSantis, by a 20% margin. Ronald Reagan, you may have heard of him, another successful and popular Republican governor, won his second election in 1970 by fewer votes than his first election. In 1966, Reagan's margin over Pat Brown had been over 15%, or almost 1 million votes. 4 years later, it was half of that, 500,000 votes, and down to 7.7% against Jesse Unruh. By comparison, Governor DeSantis's margins increased from 32,000 votes in 2018, a squeaker, from 32,000 votes to 1.5 million votes last year. By that measure, at least, DeSantis looks more promising than Reagan did at a comparable point in his career. In other words, something is happening in Florida to which political scientists might want to pay some attention. Another famous Floridian living not far from here should share some credit for that red wave, even though he wasn't on the ballot this time. When he was, however, in 2016 and 2020, Donald Trump helped to turn Florida from a classic swing state into a solid red bastion, though not nearly as solid as it is now. Whether he wins the Republican presidential nomination again in 2024 or not, you may rest assured that President Biden will be running against Mr. Trump or his specter. Just cast a glance at some of Mr. Biden's major speeches. Last summer, at the venerable Independence Hall in Philadelphia, lit blood red for the occasion, he denounced the MAGA Republicans as representing, quote, an extremism that threatens the very foundations of our republic, unquote. A week earlier, Biden told the Democratic National Committee that, quote, the extreme MAGA philosophy, unquote, was, quote, almost like semi-fascism, unquote. That's the real Biden. A year before that, he told the National Constitution Center, also coincidentally in Philadelphia, that the GOP's, not just the MAGAs, but the GOP's opposition to the Democrats' highly partisan voting rights bills amounted to, quote, a 21st century Jim Crow assault, unquote. And he didn't hesitate to draw the moral from those facts. he said, quote, "We're facing the most significant test of our democracy since the Civil War." That's not hyperbole. Since the Civil War. Now, it's easy to ignore or downplay such charges because they are made, after all, by Joe Biden. The first rule of Biden studies is to recognize that whenever he says that's not hyperbole, whatever he's talking about, it is hyperbole. The second is to try not to laugh. For example, in that same speech at Independence Hall, he confided at a particularly dramatic point in the oration, "I give you my word as a Biden." Now, this is a standard I hadn't encountered before. But I suppose it makes sense. I mean, his word is as trustworthy as Hunter Biden's marital vows, or his son's paintings, just as artful as those paintings, just as wise as Hunter's advice on the Ukrainian energy market. As tempting as it is undoubtedly to neglect President Biden's charges and assertions, familiar as they are, it is, I think, a profound political mistake. The sitting president is accusing Republicans and especially conservatives of the MAGA or New Right persuasion. And I recognize that the two are not synonymous. We'll talk about that in a moment. The president of the United States is accusing us of nothing less than abandoning the Constitution and handing over the country to, in his words, the white supremacists, the insurrectionists, and the extremists. The conservative response, I submit, needs to be more than simply sighing or guffawing. But don't get me wrong, I enjoy mutual recriminations as much as the next guy. They're a part of politics. But the tu quoque argument has its limits. Concerning the tense question of January the 6th, for example, Biden and company say repeatedly that Trump and company were engaged in plotting a coup to overturn the election. Trump et al. Say, on the contrary, they were trying to interrupt a coup by Biden et al., designed to steal the election. Soberly, I would say that both claims are exaggerations that remain unproved and perhaps unprovable, though there are people in the room who will disagree with me about that. These mutual accusations come closer to what Machiavelli would call calumnies rather than accusations, the latter of which may be focused and managed by the political system. Our problem is that we no longer know the purpose or nature of our political system. We can't agree on what constitutional government is for. Hence, it is harder and harder to tell where an election stops and a coup begins. Even if the 2020 election were not stolen in the sense of millions of votes disappearing or being switched, there is plenty of evidence it was rigged in Maggie Hemingway's sense of the term, i.e. tilted to favor the victory of the establishment party, or as I would say, of the living Constitution over the founders' Constitution. Political scientists need to stop averting their gaze from that evidence, but few will. Consider in this connection Joe Biden's own constitutional views, his alternative to MAGA extremism, as it were. Judging from that Independence Hall address, modestly titled, "Remarks on the Continued Battle for the Soul of a Nation," his standard is what he called at least 6 times in that address, our democracy. Our democracy, as you may know, has little to do with our Constitution, as Jeff Anderson pointed out in the fall CRB. Get your subscription now, by the way. though it does have many roots in the living Constitution, that is the liberals' one. Our democracy, in the sense in which President Biden used the term, and many other people on the left use the term, means, I submit, woke democracy. The first form of American government to face up to the pervasive injustice of previous American democracy. The first to acknowledge and try to overcome the country's systemic racism, a term Biden used repeatedly in the 2020 election and since. Our old democracy was built, according to him, on racism all the way down. And notice the ism at the heart of our sinfulness. The villain is not race prejudice, a fading term from the 1940s, which, as Harvey Mansfield argues, offered some possibility of redemption for our sins, insofar as prejudgments, prejudices, may be enlightened by experience and learning and replaced by judgments properly so called, better judgments. Racism, by contrast, is a systemic doctrine, a Weltanschauung. Once inside it, it is virtually impossible to escape. The only hope, then, is hope and change. This is what Biden, while vice president, seems to have learned from President Barack Obama, and before him from LBJ and FDR, two of Biden's idols. Despite endorsing the 60s New Left view of America as from the beginning and at bottom a racist or sick society, in the 60s they used to spell it with 3 Ks, America. Biden insists he is pro-American and even proud of the American creed. He gives us his word as a Biden on that. You may wonder, what in particular did he go to all the trouble of offering his word about in Philadelphia? The answer is that despite all of America's flaws and systemic injustices, he's, quote, never been more optimistic about America's future, unquote. The future guarantees or almost guarantees that the racial progress achieved so far under Democratic presidents and courts will continue. This is where Biden, as a politician, parts company, at least in tone and affect, from the more morbidly postmodern part of wokedom. I think we have to recognize this political adroitness and ambition on his part, because if we don't, we risk misunderstanding and underestimating him. What George W. Bush used to call misunderestimating your opponent. Biden wants to overcome America in the German sense, abolish it, transcend it, incorporate it. He wants to overcome America in the name of America. That's a neat political act. On that note, permit me to take up the question of the new right and its meaning. The new right, at least as I understand it so far, is a many-splendored thing. One part of it is, or at least was, eagerly supportive of Donald Trump's presidency. Another part tends to disdain MAGA because it doubts that America ever was that great, or at least that it could ever be made great again. The former reservation against America herself, perhaps chiefly identified with young and not so young right-wingers who spend too much time on the internet, bespeaks the influence of Nietzsche with his contempt for the lowness of modern democracy and for Christianity's supposed rejection of nobility and manliness. Other new rightists who don't doubt America's historic greatness or the nobility of its ideals still think we are too far gone for a revival. These two factions split the difference between them with a kind of post-American conservatism, hoping something will turn up, and effectively agreeing with Heidegger's lament that only a God can save us now. That said, there are reasons to sympathize greatly with young conservatives who have grown up in modern America, or postmodern America, who have barely experienced America as a healthy moral and political culture. The country of Billy Graham, Phyllis Schlafly, even Ronald Reagan must seem distant and foreign to them, not to mention the country of Douglas MacArthur or Frederick Douglass or George Washington. Young conservatives today have grown up surrounded by online pornography and nonstop condemnations of virtue, white males, and American history in general. Those of us who are older didn't have to endure that kind of an ordeal. You can tell a generation by its wars, too. World War II and the Cold War are now ancient history, and increasingly, so is the America that waged and won them. 9/11 is not yet forgotten, but its edge has long been dulled by the disasters of the Iraq and Afghanistan wars. So perhaps the cardinal characteristic of the new right is the vehemence with which it rejects both modern liberalism and modern conservatism. Liberalism, certainly in its woke mode, conservatism in what the new right imagines at least to be its Reagan and Buckley mode, what it calls conservatism Inc. Partly, both of these judgments stem from the MAGA impatience with losing so many cultural and political battles. And the record of political losses is quite substantial, and we shouldn't blink that fact. More deeply, the disdain for movement conservatism stems from the new right's doubt that conservatism Inc. ever wanted to win. Two readily identifiable versions of the new right argument, neither of which completely overmaps with what I was saying because this is a complicated movement or phenomenon. Yoram Hazony's national conservatism and the post-liberalism of Patrick Deneen, Sohrab Ahmari, Adrian Vermeule, and others agree more or less in asserting that Reagan-Buckley conservatism was insufficiently political and especially too libertarian, valuing economic conservatism over social conservatism. Along with the Trumpists, they advise that the nation should adopt policies to shore up the middle class, and particularly middle-class families, in the name not only of economic justice, but more importantly, of a sounder moral community, better family life. After that consensus, these two schools of thought part company, disputing over the means to those agreed upon ends. For example, do we need more Catholic immigrant families from Mexico and Central America to make this a more pro-family and religious country, or fewer? I have reservations about both national conservatism and the post-liberal neo-integralist, as they're sometimes called, arguments, which I've expressed elsewhere and don't need to repeat here, especially with the rich variety of panels awaiting us. Suffice it to say that all nationalisms, like all nations, are not created equal, and that as obligatory as the common good is for any polity, the highest good, the summum bonum, shouldn't be confused with it. The common good and the highest good are two different things. Permit me, though, to address more narrowly the new right in the context of the American political tradition. Say what you will about the libertarians, they were right about the modern state, right to warn of its self-justifying ambitions and its drive to overcome all those inventions of prudence the Federalist patiently explained are essential to liberty and the common good both. The libertarians, were right to warn us against socialism with all of its enticements and dangers. The New Right sometimes talks as though we don't have to worry about the first and second waves of liberalism anymore, about the living constitution and the welfare state and the problem of the state control of the economy, because the problem of wokeness, which if I'm right, comes from the third wave of liberalism, the 60s liberalism, these problems are so much more urgent and oppressive. I agree. The problems of wokeness are more urgent and oppressive. But those old-fashioned problems from the New Deal and from the progressive era are still there, and someday will be urgent again, and in the meantime can hardly be said to make wokeness any better. It is true that the traditionalist versus libertarian fusionism of old is what we in California would call an inactive fault line. It's not where the beating heart of conservatism is anymore. And in fact, I'm not sure it was there in the 60s either, despite all the pages and conferences devoted to it, many of which I attended. Most conservatives back then, most actual American conservatives, were both social and economic conservatives, and something more, what John Fonte, for example, calls patriotic conservatives. They were anti-tax and pro-school prayer. They were anti-communist and pro-America, all at the same time. The drama of Buckley-style conservatism, which was part of the so-called new conservatives after World War II, I think lay not really in these formulas of fusionism that the magazine National Review helped to promote. Frank Meyer is sort of the chief architect of them. But the drama was really in the conflicts that the nascent conservative movement had to go through, had to fight through, and in a certain way was happy to fight. The first of these, where the real life, you could say, of actual American conservatism, not the formula conservatism of fusionism, took place, was the fight over McCarthyism, the fight over internal security and internal corruption, which meant over the evil of communism and the goodness of America. A debate not so far, really, from today's debate over wokeism. The second great focus was on the civil rights revolution, beginning with Brown, the Brown v. Board of Education decision in 1954, and reaching a kind of peak in 1964-65 with the Civil Rights Act and the Voting Rights Act. This debate, too, was over the goodness of America and its implications for the question of segregation. National Review and Bill Buckley, who was, of course, an old friend of mine and a co-author of a book, co-editor of a book with me, or I with him, I should say, really, were roundly condemned for their tortuous attempts to find a non-racist way to defend what Buckley called the civilization of the South. And he, in a way, repented, at least partly, of some of the arguments he made in the 50s and the early 60s. Yet many of the constitutional and social problems that he and National Review foresaw from the, let us say, anti-racist politics of his own day came to pass more or less as they predicted, from busing to affirmative action to social justice riots. Mark my word, the left is not through with Buckley and his legacy. They are coming for him, desperate to show he was a white supremacist, and that Trump's populist authoritarianism, as we political scientists sometimes call it, wrongly, but still, was in fact, Trump's populism was just a rebirth of Buckley's from the 1950s. Racist all the way down, as they say. The new right, therefore, will soon find itself challenged to defend the old new right, the Buckley right. That's another reason why a reflexive disdain for Buckley-Reagan conservatism is, in my view at least, ill-advised. Our fathers fought battles from which we can still learn, and for principles that they traced back, at least in the best cases, across the American political tradition to the American founding. Buckley and Reagan may not always have been right, but they were more right than we think nowadays. Rather than flirting with Nietzsche and Gramsci and medieval clerics, however wise they may have been on many questions, the key to the new right's future, at least in my view, will probably begin with its past and with the thoughtful interrogation of the American political tradition and the founding. It's not that the Buckley right didn't want to win. That was the problem they diagnosed with Wendell Willkie and Thomas Dewey, with what they called the Me Too, Buckley called the Me Too Republicans, the liberal establishment of the Republican Party within the post-New Deal party, which resurrected itself in the consultants and donor class of the GOP after Ronald Reagan. It might be closer to the mark to say Reagan and his generation of political leadership didn't quite know how to win. They wanted to win. They won many victories, of course, but Reagan in his farewell address admits they had not won the biggest, the most important victory of all, which was to make it possible to believe in America again and to pass that on to future generations of Americans. So I think they wanted to win. Even Goldwater, when he ran and he knew he was going to lose, felt it was worthwhile to run for the future. And Reagan, who was an avid supporter of Goldwater, seemed to have that view too, and then in his own life lived it out. But maybe they didn't know quite how to win. But on that front, we have at least one advantage. Lessons from the red tidal wave of victories in Florida and from the battles going on here right before our eyes. In 1951, Buckley published his first book, God and Man at Yale. In that book, he prophesied the problem of the university. He saw already that the internal intellectual and moral corruption of the university was the deepest problem facing America. His solution to that problem was to try to take back the universities from their faculty, their left-wing faculty, and give control of them back to their trustees, acting on behalf of the alumni. Buckley's solution has never really been tried. When it was tried in miniature at Dartmouth and a few other well-known colleges, they changed the rules of the elections so that alumni could not elect members of the Board of Trustees. That's liberalism for you. But I will end by saying Ron DeSantis is for the first time trying the Buckley strategy in Florida of acting through the boards of trustees, in this case of public universities, which are subject to his selection at certain intervals, to see if the trustees can, in fact, take back the university from the left and the sort of the nihilistic radicals who accompany the professors on that path. We'll see if he succeeds. It's going to be a long fight, not a short fight, and so it's impossible to predict victory in Florida, but I think he deserves victory, And I think that if he does manage to have a success here, Bill Buckley will be smiling down on him from some celestial standpoint. Thank you very much. Do we have time for some questions or not? Yes, okay. And there are microphones, I see.
Thank you. I was interested in your notion that one needs to look to the past to guide us forward. And you suggested a few topics, a few conflicts, fissures to focus on. It struck me, though, that there was a name of one person who weren't mentioned who was involved in all of these. I think of the McCarthy ones you mentioned, the civil rights, the effort to navigate that. You mentioned the problem of the state the emerging from the New Deal. You alluded to the problem of progressivism and the way it reconstructed government. There was someone who was at the front of all three of those battles, in the heart of it. His name is Richard Nixon. Mm-hmm. What is the view, perhaps, that we need to have, perhaps a revisionist view towards Nixon, in your assessment?
Nixon, of course, is an interesting case, to say the least. Buckley's sort of formulation for him, I talked about Nixon with him once, and his formula was that Nixon was with the conservative movement, but not of the conservative movement. And his, it may be really that his kind of conservatism was well suited for the moment of crisis in the 60s when he was president. That is, he wanted to keep the vital center together. And so, favorite conservative schemes over the years for rolling back the New Deal, for going on the offensive against communism, and so forth, he had no patience for, because they were unrealistic under the circumstances of already being in a war in Vietnam, which we were not winning, and facing, radicals in the streets and in the universities, and race riots throughout the country. If he could just get the country through that as one country, the same country, that would be a big success. And I think that's how he more or less defined political success under those circumstances. In the second term, he had some other ambitions, which were cut short, of course, by Watergate, coincidentally or not. And so we don't really know where Nixon would have taken his conservatism, as it were, if he'd had a full second term with which to pursue some more serious domestic reforms. But he was a famous anti-communist, a friend of Whittaker Chambers, but he was also Eisenhower's vice president. So even though he and Nelson Rockefeller, of course, fell out politically, and Nixon defined himself as being to the right of Rockefeller, wherever that was exactly, he was also, I would say, to the left of Goldwater, and he was in many ways still a kind of establishment Republican from the 50s. But who knows, in 1972, 3, 4, 5, 6, if he had been in power that much longer, he might have had some more radically conservative thoughts.
Charles, thank you very much. I wanted to ask your view on this. The left seems to use an awful lot of emotion and psychology, where I think we use a lot of, hopefully, reason and facts. They appeal to feelings, they appeal to identities, to victimhood, to envy, to equity rather than equality. This seems to have taken hold of a lot of people. What are your thoughts about that?
Well, undoubtedly that's true. I mean, but conservatives have their own emotional appeals and principled appeals. I mean, what is patriotism but a huge, union of principle and passion on behalf of a good country? And I think that we perhaps, one of the things that troubles me about the new right is that it's not so clear about America, whether it has given up on America or is prepared to think about giving up on America or not. And it seems to me that would be a colossal mistake, practically and morally at the same time, because there are enormous, if you, the latest examples of this might be Trump rallies, but you could go back to the 60s, the 70s. Every generation has surprisingly sweeping ceremonies of flag raising and of rallying for the Republic. And it seems to me that we haven't consistently exploited that, drawn on that into our appeal for America. And so, the genius of the left has been certainly from, let's say, FDR on, the more successful left, the high left, if you want to call it that, has been to try to identify with the American Revolution and to argue that the New Deal, whatever it is, Great Society, is simply what the founders would have done had they been here today. And, it's just updating the founding. It's not contradicting it or abandoning it. And to a surprising extent, I think they've gotten away with it. And they're no longer the majority party in America, but for a generation or two, they were the majority party in America. And Republicans were not. And now neither one is a true majority party in the old sense. But, if that's why not challenging Biden's phony constitutionalism and his imprecations directed at the right, it seems to me a mistake. And it's not enough to say he stole the election, because that gets you into that whole controversy, as I was saying. We ought to have constitutional objections to him, the policies he's pursuing, the goals that he sets out. And we don't have that very much. Trump was never really capable of that, or at least he didn't do it. And, it's now 4 years later, or almost. We'll see what our guys have to say about the liberal regime, if you want to call it that.
Just a quick question. With the overturning the Roe versus Wade decision, it sort of puts the moral question before the American people, kind of in the first time in generations, to think this issue through now that it's pretty much relegated from state to state.
Right.
So what are your thoughts on this kind of transitional or watershed moment on that pivotal issue?
Well, it is a very important moment, I think. For one thing, one of the reasons why the left is so agog at what happened is that the abortion right is sort of the prototypical modern liberal right. That is, it was more or less invented by experts, in the judiciary and the policy world and imposed on the country. All 50 states had their abortion laws struck down as a result of Roe, and they had to scramble to keep up with the latest instructions from the Supreme Court about what their new laws would have to be like. And we in overturning that, clearly, it sent a kind of shiver down the spine of liberals and liberalism, because if constructed rights, if invented rights even those with a patina of 50 years of tradition now behind them can be extinguished like that. All of the regime of rights that has been constructed over the past 50 years is suddenly up for grabs. So that's why they're right to worry about it. I mean, unfortunately, as so often happens, conservatives were caught wrong-footed by their own success. I mean, we won after, incredible ordeals of trying to get a court that would overturn Roe, again and again with new combinations of justices, all of whom somehow disappointed us along the way, or most of whom disappointed us along the way, until we finally got, thanks to Trump, this combination. And yet, we had no real defense of it. We didn't know what to say next. And that's on us, I think. I mean, you can either say, this was an imposition, we're returning it to the states, that's the constitutional solution to the problem. If New York wants a very liberal abortion law, it can have a very liberal abortion law. But if Utah wants a very strict anti-abortion regime, it can have that too. That's one way of answering the question. The other is to say, of course, now we're going to go after abortion everywhere and make it illegal, have a rigorous regime everywhere. Well, that's not what we used to say on the question. And we were caught off guard. We sort of blurted out what we wanted, or what we thought we wanted at that moment. And that was untidy and disadvantageous to us, no doubt. We were making a kind of Lincolnian argument that, he was against slavery, but he was not in favor of the abolition of slavery everywhere all at once. He was in favor of gradual, conversion of the American mind to an anti-slavery position and a long-term political campaign to get rid of slavery. And that was sort of our position on abortion. We had a kind of quasi-Lincolnian argument. But then suddenly, flushed, by the excitement of winning at last this big victory, we went whole hog. And it is a serious question of political strategy and political philosophy. Which direction do you want to take the country? And which do you think is advisable? A long-term strategy of gradual persuasion, or a very short-term strategy to try to take your success and ride it immediately into law?
I think we need to understand the epistemology of that, because we really do have to win the hearts and minds of
Right. No, that's right. And abortion is in some ways a more difficult question than slavery, because the injustice of it is less obvious, in many ways at least, than the injustice of slavery. So the job of conversion is harder. Yeah. Who has the microphone?
To what extent is what we see going on in the left today, particularly the more extreme left, a function of Marxism? Is Marxism dead in the United States, or is what we're seeing a function of some, if not Marxist-Leninist Marxism, maybe Gramsci's version of subverting the culture? I mean, is Marxism behind, in your view, a good deal of what we're seeing on the left today?
Well, Marxism, scientific Marxism may be dead. But I think Marxism more broadly as a philosophy is not dead. It has transmuted itself somewhat. Now, those parts of Marx that are closest to Nietzsche are still very, very powerful. So the division between oppressors and oppressed is fundamentals. You can use that on many, many issues: race, sex, gender identity, and other kinds of identity. That's very handy. But when you add to that the nobility of the struggle against the oppressor, you're getting closer to Nietzsche there, where you find meaning out of waging that struggle. Whether you win it or not is in a way less important than it gives you an identity and gives your life a kind of transcendent purpose. It raises your sights and makes you and brings you out of a kind of torpor and mediocrity, which is, from the Nietzschean point of view, very much the order of the day in democracies. This gives you a way to be a kind of Superman for justice. And that is very attractive on the left. And I think in that sense, Marx, when combined with Nietzsche or brought closer to Nietzsche, gains power over the sort of the technocratic predictions of, immiseration of the working class and so forth. That's much closer to being dead, I think.
Could you tell us what some of the roadblocks might be to reforming New College?
Well, there's the faculty, there are the students, and there are the alumni. But other than that, it's difficult because the new college started out as a successful experiment. And in its first, say, 10 years, it attracted very good students who didn't want to be, part of the academic machine. And they didn't want grades, they wanted sort of essays from their professors describing their achievement in a course. And they still have that, these narrative evaluations, they're called. They don't have grades. Instead of that, they get a kind of narrative evaluation. But that's really pass-fail, because you can fail if you get a bad narrative evaluation. But it's still individualized, extremely individualized, and it's very easy to make your own major and to sort of design your own pathway. So New College has about 100 faculty, and it has 50 majors. That's a lot of majors for 100 faculty. And that's because many of the majors have one person in them at any given time. Often they have zero. A lot of empty majors. And there are other problems. There's a lot of deferred maintenance on the campus, which is absolutely almost impossible to understand. Over $100 million in deferred maintenance. So what the college has been doing the last 10 or 15 years is about every year or two, they have to close a building down because they can't afford to bring it back up to code. So the campus is littered with former dormitories, former classrooms, former laboratory buildings that are unusable, but they don't have the money to restore them. They promised, foolishly, 10 years ago or so, that they would grow the number of students to 1,250, and hoping that the tuition increase would allow them to fund all the regular necessary parts of a college. They have about 700 students now. So they are way behind where they're supposed to be. And they just don't generate enough tuition to run the place as they had promised to run it. So there are real organic problems. Nonetheless, the old generation, so to speak, likes it because it was good when they were there. They had a great time. And the young generation is heavily woke. So I've seen a survey that the college took which shows that 75% of the students call themselves either liberal or very liberal. And about 10% call themselves maybe conservative. Most call themselves something in between. But that's a fairly top-heavy or one-sided student body. If your mission is, liberal education in the sense of really confronting, clashing arguments and opinions. So it's a long-term project because it requires restoring fiscal integrity to the place and then working on the educational integrity side. And we can't, here's where being a Burkean conservative comes in handy. Because as a Burkean, you have to sort of take the institution that you're given and the people who are in that institution, and you have to gradually change it in favorable or healthy directions. But you can't simply wipe them all away and start with a blank slate. You don't have that right. You don't have that ability. So you have to prudently go forward as best you can. But the governor has made it possible to do a lot quickly because he has, in one fell swoop, changed the political and educational complexion of the board by making 7 appointments all at once on the 13-man board. So we have the opportunity, but it's going to be difficult. One more, maybe, before we...
Thank you for your comments. Very interesting. So I hear you saying, to those of us on the new right, I may or may not be part of that, that we shouldn't be so quick to discard Buckley and Reagan and the conservative movement of the 20th century. They got a lot of things right, even though they got some things wrong. They are our forefathers or forebears in a way. We should learn from them as well. The woke left is coming for them, and we should be prepared to defend them. Now, I think the new right response to that would be to deny the premise of your argument, which is to say that the new right is somehow a conservative movement. Mm-hmm. They don't view themselves as a conservative movement. In fact, they think of Buckley and Reagan, the social conservatism, the libertarian market, the neocon policy wonks and warhawks as itself a perversion of the best American political tradition. And so they don't see themselves as a conserving that, but as building afresh by jumping over that back to a different understanding of, America. So how would you respond to that objection?
Well, if you're talking about refounding, a new constitutional order, that's a very big objective. And I don't see any preparation in thought or in reality for something that big. What I hear is a lament, properly so in my view, for the lost excellences of the original constitutional system. But that would seem to lead to the restoral or the restoration of that original system, and not to an entirely new system, especially if it has somehow new principles that will not be captured as the old principles were captured somehow by their enemies. What are those principles? How are you going to seal them off from the usual problems of democratic degradation and ideological invasion and so forth? Exactly what are we talking about? Are we doing it with the consent of the governed or against the consent of the governed? And those are the questions you have to ask if you're really serious about that. It seems to me that most of my friends, I have a lot of friends, obviously. I mean, in some ways, the new right is a generational thing. There are younger people on the right who are frustrated with the failures of the old conservatism and with the as I was saying, the sort of moral climate of America. It's not, a country to be loved must be lovely, if I may roughly paraphrase Edmund Burke. This has not been a very lovely country for at least a generation, maybe 2 generations. It's harder to love it than it was if you're older and you saw more of a healthy America. And I tried to say, I'm aware of that, and I think that's a huge problem, and I'm not shutting my eyes to it. But for conservatives in general, that's a problem because it argues against restoration if you've never seen anything better than what you've got now. That argues for revolution or for some new, really new beginning. But the problem with new beginnings is you like with New College, you start with the people you have and the institutions you have. And so what is it you're proposing to do exactly? If not persuade the people differently, what is your game plan? Yeah. Yeah, no, I mean, I wrote a book called Crisis of the Two Constitutions, in which, the cold Civil War, I describe and I sort of explain how it came to be, and I raise various possibilities about how we might get out of it or what comes next. And one of those was if we could win, then the cold Civil War would be over. If we could win elections consistently for a generation, then it could be a different country, meaning a better country. If we can't change people's minds, then we perhaps could change the subject. If our politics was totally changed, the pandemic looked as though this might be such a game changer coming from outside the system that our politics would have to adjust to it. But on the contrary, they easily took the pandemic in, and it became simply another issue to divide liberals and conservatives. And we could have new things to fight about. We could fight about vaxxing. We could fight about masking, all the nasty stuff that we went through in the past couple of years simply dropped into the liberal conservative back and forth. So that leaves us with 3 other possibilities, at least as I saw them. One was a transformation or a sort of large-scale renewal of federalism, in which red states will govern themselves more than they are able to now. Blue states will govern themselves, and will have a kind of agreement to disagree, but still within the United States for some purposes. It's hard to see how that's going to happen. Liberalism has been all about nationalizing issues and reducing the states to laboratories for national experimentation at best. So that leaves only, secession. You get 2 nations or 3 nations, probably 2, out of the country. And what, at least in our past experiment, follows secession, the 5th thing, war, to settle it. And I don't think, those are not good options. So we're still working on option 1, trying to win the debate and show, as Governor DeSantis has begun to show, results beginning in his state, and hope. And he's had an enormous reaction of popular support, much greater than he had 4 years ago. And Republicans swept essentially 4 new Congress seats. The senator was reelected. Both houses of the state legislature are held by supermajorities of Republicans now. That's a good path that he started down, at least. So I see his example in particular, but there are other states where good things are happening too. I think looking to the states right now is the prudent thing to do, and see if you can't parlay some really good governor into a president and an administration that would really have a ambitious agenda of reform and restoration with the people's consent. Okay, thank you.